August 21, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle is pitch black. The air, heavy, wet, and still. Japanese infantry creep forward, bayonets fixed, whispering in the dark. They've launched dozens of night assaults before. They expect rifle fire, maybe machine guns. A flare bursts overhead. The jungle lights up. Boom! The blast is deafening. Then another, and another. Shotguns, 12-gauge, short-barreled, brutal. Buckshot rips through the charging line, shredding the night. Men fall before they ever reach the wire. Marines pump and fire in rhythm. Boom, pump, boom. It's like a hammer smashing through the silence. Panic spreads through the assaulting ranks. This isn't in the manuals. One Marine mutters, "They didn't see that coming." A simple shotgun, born in the trenches of the last war, has just rewritten the rules of jungle fighting. This is the story of how 12-gauge thunder met the Japanese bayonet charge. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Join us as we bring forgotten battles, legendary machines, and real stories of war back to life. One shot, one step, one moment in history at a time. The Japanese infantry were ready for bayonets and rifles. What they weren't ready for was a shotgun. The American 12-gauge wasn't standard issue for every Marine. It wasn't glamorous like the Garand. It wasn't a machine gun. It was simple. A short-barreled, pump-action shotgun designed to do one thing: stop a man dead in his tracks at close range. This weapon had a reputation long before it reached the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. In the muddy trenches of Europe during the First World War, American troops learned just how devastating buckshot could be in confined, close-quarters fighting. German soldiers called it inhumane. The US called it effective. Now, 2 decades later, it was back. Not in trenches, but in a jungle. The M1897 and M1912 trench shotguns, their wooden stocks slick with sweat, were carried by Marines, raiders, and patrol units moving through terrain where you could barely see 10 feet ahead. In that kind of fighting, speed mattered. A shotgun didn't jam easily. It didn't need pinpoint aim. One pull of the trigger could clear a path. In ambushes and night assaults, it hit harder than any rifle could. When the Japanese launched their first determined night attacks on Guadalcanal, they expected a clash of bayonets and bullets. Instead, they walked into a storm of lead they had never trained for. A weapon designed for hunting and trench raiding was about to shatter an entire doctrine of close-range assault. It was a reminder of a brutal truth. The deadliest weapons aren't always the most modern, just the most suited to the battlefield. The jungle on Guadalcanal wasn't just terrain, it was a living enemy. Tall palms and tangled vines wove a canopy so thick that even midday sunlight barely reached the ground. Visibility shrank to a few feet. The air was wet, heavy, and hot. Every breath tasted like mud and decay. For soldiers moving through it, nothing felt safe. A single misstep could send a branch cracking, giving away your position. The Japanese infantry were trained to move silently, slipping between trees like ghosts. But even for them, the jungle slowed everything. This kind of fighting turned traditional marksmanship into a guessing game. A rifle designed to hit targets at hundreds of yards was suddenly a clumsy tool when the enemy could appear 5 feet away. Bayonet charges, perfected on open ground and city streets, lost their edge when men collided in darkness and vines. But for the shotgun, this was perfect hunting ground. The pump-action 12-gauge didn't care about distance. At close range, buckshot fanned out in a deadly cone. In tight jungle trails, it didn't need precision. It just needed a heartbeat's warning. When Japanese assault units crept toward Marine positions at night, they weren't just facing soldiers. They were facing men embedded in a terrain that worked against them. Every root, every bush, every puddle became part of the defense. Rain soaked the barrels, sweat dripped down faces, mosquitoes swarmed. But one thing cut through it all: the brutal, unmistakable blast of a shotgun echoing through the trees. In this jungle, the fight wasn't about who had the better tactics. It was about who adapted faster to a world that swallowed light and sound. The first real clash came in the darkness, a humid night that wrapped around the Marines like a wet blanket. The Japanese infantry advanced in disciplined silence, rifles fixed with bayonets, confident in their assault tactics. They'd used this same method before. Approach under cover of darkness, close the distance fast, overwhelm with speed and steel. On the American line, a few Marines crouched low behind sandbags and tangled wire. Some gripped garans, but others held something different. Short, stubby pump-action shotguns, their metal cool and slick in the damp air. A distant rustle, a low splash, then the sound of boots in the mud. The Japanese were close. Too close. Flares hissed skyward, casting the jungle in ghostly light. The first wave burst through the tree line, shouting war cries. But before they could close in, a wall of buckshot erupted. The sound was thunderous. One blast, then 5 more in rapid rhythm. Men in the front ranks dropped instantly, their formation breaking apart. The bayonet charge stumbled, confused, unsure what had hit them. The Japanese had no experience against this kind of fire. They were prepared for the sharp crack of rifles, not the gut-punch roar of a 12-gauge. Survivors dove for cover, but the jungle offered little. Every step forward meant stepping into a cone of lead. The shotgun wasn't just stopping them, it was shaking their nerve. One Marine, his hands black with powder and sweat, whispered to the man beside him, "They're not used to this." In that single night, an old weapon proved it could turn an assault into a slaughter. The jungle belonged to whoever fired first. And fastest. War has its own language. The scream of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the sharp crack of rifles. But on Guadalcanal, the Japanese infantry heard something different. A shotgun blast doesn't echo like a rifle. It slams. A single 12-gauge boom punches through the night like thunder cracking overhead. At close range, it feels less like a sound and more like a physical blow. A shockwave that shakes the chest. The first time the Japanese encountered this sound in combat, they didn't understand what it was. Men in the front rank fell without warning, their momentum erased in an instant. The roar came again, short, fast, rhythmic, pump, boom, pump, boom. For an assault built on speed and aggression, hesitation was deadly. And that's exactly what the shotgun did. It made them hesitate. It froze movement, shattered formation, and tore the confidence out of every charge. The night flares cast pale light over the battlefield. Smoke hung low over the mud. Shouts turned to confusion. Japanese soldiers dived for tree trunks and roots, trying to find cover that didn't exist. A few fired back blindly, but they couldn't see where the blasts came from. For the Marines, this was exactly what they needed. In the darkness, they became hunters. Each shotgun blast cut through the jungle like a judge's gavel, deciding life and death in a heartbeat. One Marine later wrote in a letter home, "It's not just the damage it does, it's what it does to their heads. They stop running." The sound of the shotgun didn't just kill, it controlled the battlefield. If you're enjoying this journey through forgotten battlefields, make sure to subscribe. Join us as we uncover the moments, the weapons, and the soldiers that shaped the course of history. Long before it thundered through the jungles of the Pacific, the combat shotgun earned its name in the mud of Europe. In 1918, American troops stormed the trenches of the Western Front armed with the trench broom, short-barreled pump-action shotguns built for one purpose, close-quarters destruction. The weapon of choice was the Winchester Model 1897 and its successor, the Winchester Model 1912. Both could be fired fast, one shell after another, by simply holding down the trigger and pumping, a method the soldiers called slam fire. In a space no wider than a kitchen hallway, a single Marine could clear an enemy position in seconds. The German army protested to the world, calling the weapon inhumane. The US ignored it. They knew exactly what they had. 2 decades later, that same design returned. Not much had changed, because it didn't need to. Simple, reliable, devastating. The wooden stock and steel receiver were rugged enough to survive mud, rain, and blood. On Guadalcanal, the Marines didn't need long-range accuracy. They needed power they could trust in the dark. The shotgun fit perfectly. It didn't jam easily. It worked in the rain. And it turned every few feet of jungle into a killing zone. To the Japanese infantry, this was alien. Their doctrine leaned on bayonet charges, shock tactics, and endurance. They were prepared to meet rifles and machine guns head-on, not face a wall of buckshot at point-blank range. A weapon born in the trenches of Europe had found its second war in the Pacific. Old steel, new jungle. Same purpose, end the fight fast. The island looked like paradise from the air, green, wild, untouched. But on the ground, Guadalcanal was a nightmare. Rain fell without warning. Heat rose like steam from the soaked earth. The jungle floor was slick, uneven, and alive with insects. At night, a thick fog rolled through the trees, blurring the toad. Edges of everything. You couldn't tell where the ground ended and the shadows began. For the Marines holding their fragile perimeter near Henderson Field, the jungle wasn't just background. It was a wall of darkness that could swallow an entire platoon. Every rustle could be an animal, or a Japanese scout. Every whisper of wind could be a bayonet sliding through the undergrowth. The Japanese infantry used this to their advantage. They moved low, silent, almost invisible. But the same darkness that cloaked them also betrayed them. In the damp air, sound carried. A single snapped twig could give away a flanking team. That's where the shotgun came in. In the dense foliage, rifles struggled. Machine guns needed fixed lanes of fire. But a 12-gauge didn't need space. A Marine with a shotgun could wait in silence, then unleash a cone of lead that turned narrow trails into kill zones. The terrain made precision obsolete. It rewarded whoever reacted first, whoever had the faster trigger and the wider spread. The shotgun was built for this kind of fight, even if the island itself seemed determined to drown everyone in mud. In Guadalcanal's shadow, the jungle chose the weapon, and it chose the shotgun. Not every American unit on Guadalcanal carried shotguns, but those who did used them with brutal efficiency. Among the most feared were the Marine Raiders. Light, fast, and trained for jungle warfare, they were built for the kind of combat that the island demanded. Small units, close-in fighting, silent patrols followed by sudden violence. Raiders often carried shotguns not as secondary weapons, but as their first choice. Their preferred models, the Winchester Model 1897 and Winchester Model 1912, were compact, reliable, and devastating. A trained Marine could pump out 5 shells in seconds. With buckshot spreading like a fan, a single blast could knock down multiple charging men. Regular Marine infantry companies soon followed their lead. On jungle patrols, 1 or 2 men per squad often carried a shotgun. These weren't random assignments. Those Marines were chosen carefully. Steady hands, quick reflexes, men who wouldn't flinch in a night ambush. Shotgun carriers became the silent guardians of the perimeter. They were the ones waiting in the dark when the Japanese crept forward. They were the first line of fire. In Marine foxholes, shotguns were passed around like trusted tools. Men knew what they could do. One Marine later wrote, "If you had a shotgun, the boys wanted to be near you." The Raiders in particular became legends. Their hit-and-run operations used the weapon in the most unforgiving terrain, where rifle fire scattered harmlessly into trees. But the shotgun didn't scatter. It crushed everything in its path. In the hands of the Raiders and the Line Marines, the 12-gauge wasn't just a weapon. It was a message. If you came close, you wouldn't leave. For decades, the Japanese infantry had relied on the bayonet charge. It was their signature, their pride, their doctrine. On open ground, it was terrifying. A coordinated rush of screaming soldiers, blades fixed, meant to shock and overwhelm defenders. Many times before, it had worked. But on Guadalcanal, they were about to collide with something they'd never trained to face: buckshot. The night was wet and hot. A thick fog clung to the jungle floor as a Japanese assault unit crept toward the Marine perimeter. They moved low, rifles ready, bayonets gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Then, as the first ranks emerged from the tree line, the Marines opened fire, not with distant rifles, not with suppressing machine gun bursts, but with short, thunderous shotgun blasts. The charge faltered. Men in the front row fell instantly. A wall of buckshot chewed through the assault line, knocking soldiers off their feet before they could even raise their rifles. The Japanese screamed and surged again, but the Marines stood their ground, pumping and firing in rhythm. Each blast cut swaths through the charging ranks. The closer they got, the deadlier it became. Bayonets meant nothing at 10 feet. Some attackers never made it to the wire. Those who did were met by shotgun-wielding Marines waiting in the dark, barrels almost touching. It was brutal, fast, and final. For the Japanese infantry, trained to win by sheer will and shock, this was disorienting. The closer they came, the more they died. The bayonet had met its match, and on this island, the shotgun was judge, jury, and executioner. The night assault came fast and silent. It was just past midnight when the first Japanese soldiers slipped out of the jungle toward the Marine perimeter near Henderson Field. In a shallow foxhole, Sergeant James "Red" Callahan, a stocky Marine with hands like iron, waited with his Winchester Model 1897 shotgun across his lap. The humidity made his shirt cling to his back. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he didn't blink. He'd been on the line for too many nights like this. The jungle rustled. A faint click of a rifle bolt. They were close. Callahan didn't call out. He just raised the barrel, eyes steady on the dark tree line. The first flare hissed up, bathing the night in harsh light. And there they were. A wave of Japanese infantry charging, bayonets fixed, shouting into the smoke. He didn't hesitate. Pump, boom, pump, boom. The front rank dropped like wheat under a scythe. He racked the action fast, barely aiming. He didn't need to. Buckshot fanned out, cutting through the assault. A grenade landed near the wire. He ducked, mud splashing into his face as it went off. Ears ringing, he came up firing again, blood streaking his cheek, but grip steady on the shotgun. The Japanese pushed hard, but each step cost them lives. Callahan fired until the barrel smoked, until the jungle was littered with broken bayonets and silent bodies. One of his men later said, "He held that line like it was his front porch." On that night, one Marine and one shotgun turned what could have been a breakthrough into a massacre. The weapon didn't just stop the charge, it anchored the defense. After those first brutal encounters, the Marines began to change how they fought. The shotgun wasn't just a supporting tool anymore. It was a tactical advantage. In the early days on Guadalcanal, American units relied heavily on riflemen and machine guns to hold the line. But once they saw what a single 12-gauge could do in the thick jungle, squad leaders began reshaping their defensive plans. Patrols were reorganized. Shotgun carriers were placed at the front and flanks, the points of first contact. Their job wasn't to trade fire, it was to end ambushes before they began. Perimeter defenses changed too. Instead of focusing all their strength on machine gun nests, Marines began building small, hidden positions where shotgun men could wait quietly in the dark. The first sound the Japanese often heard was the roar of buckshot, not the rattle of a rifle. This shift was subtle but decisive. Japanese night assaults were built on momentum. Break the front rank, and the rest faltered. A shotgun did exactly that, fast and violently. Even in daytime jungle sweeps, tactics adapted. Raiders and infantry squads used shotguns to clear thickets, caves, and foxholes where a rifle couldn't swing or aim quickly enough. A Marine lieutenant later wrote in his journal, "We stopped trying to fight their way. We made them fight ours." The Japanese infantry had trained for linear, aggressive attacks, but the Americans were learning to fight like hunters, waiting, listening, and striking first with overwhelming force. The Japanese infantry had built their doctrine around aggression, shock, speed, precision. But on Guadalcanal, that doctrine was bleeding out in the mud. The first encounters with American shotguns left entire assault waves shattered before they could even reach the wire. But the Japanese were not a force that gave up easily. They adapted, or tried to. Scouts were pushed forward earlier in the night, tasked with pinpointing Marine positions before the main assault. Bayonet charges became less direct. Instead of straight lines, they began spreading out, hoping to flank or encircle the defenders. Some units even started using deception, creeping forward silently, then freezing when they suspected shotgun ambushes. They'd send a few men charging to draw fire, then strike from another angle. It was smart, ruthless, but the terrain still favored the defenders. The jungle was too tight, the trails too narrow. Buckshot didn't care about flanking formations. It didn't need to aim. It just needed the enemy to come close, and they always did. Marines adjusted just as quickly, laying out hidden positions and letting the Japanese walk straight into the storm. In captured diaries, some Japanese soldiers described the shotgun with fear. One wrote, "A single blast kills many. It is like a cannon in the trees." No amount of courage could change the math. A bayonet was deadly at arm's length. A shotgun was deadly before they ever got there. The Japanese tried to match it with cunning, but in that dark, wet jungle, cunning wasn't enough. The tide of the night battles had turned, and the shotgun was now dictating the rhythm of war. Every battlefield breeds legends. Guadalcanal was no different. In the months after the fighting, stories spread through marine camps and across the Pacific Fleet. Stories of men with shotguns cutting down entire platoons, of single blasts sending attaches, hookers flying backward. Some of it was true. Some of it was the kind of myth that war loves to create. The 12-gauge was a terrifying weapon, but it wasn't magic. It didn't have unlimited range. It didn't punch through heavy cover. But what it did better than anything else. Dominate at close range. Buckshot didn't travel far before it began to spread. Past 25 or 30 yards, its power dropped fast. But on Guadalcanal, where most fights happened at 5, 10, maybe 15 yards, that didn't matter. That was its world. The Japanese were never blown off their feet like some campfire stories claimed, but they were hit hard, often multiple pellets at once, dropping them fast and ending the charge before it fully began. And that speed of impact, that sudden, unstoppable wall of fire, was what made the shotgun legendary. Even among the Marines, some saw it as a specialist's tool, not a main weapon. But those who carried it knew better. They knew what it meant to hear a twig snap, raise that short barrel, and end a fight before it ever started. The myths made the shotgun sound supernatural. The reality was simpler and more frightening. It didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to work where the jungle was tight and the enemy was close. The jungle was brutal, but the swamps of Guadalcanal were worse. Here the air turned thick and sour. The ground was a black soup of mud, water and rotting vegetation. Each step sucked at a man's boots. Mosquitoes swarmed like smoke. You couldn't run here. You could barely walk, and that made it the perfect place for ambushes. Marines on swamp patrols carried light. Rifles were cumbersome in the muck. Bayonets were useless. But a short pump-action shotgun? That was a different story. It could be fired from the hip, fast, without perfect footing or clean sight lines. It didn't need a clear field of fire, just a direction and a target. Japanese troops tried to use the swamps to flank Marine positions, thinking the Americans wouldn't follow. But patrols did follow. Shotgun men moved at the front of those slow, miserable advances, eyes sharp, boots sinking. When contact came, it was always sudden. A rustle, a breath, a face appearing out of the fog. In that instant, the shotgun was king. One blast at close range in the swamp didn't just drop the front man. It broke the attack before it started. Sound rolled low and heavy through the mist, echoing between trees like a drumbeat. The Japanese learned quickly to fear those swamp patrols. The jungle at least gave them room to maneuver. The swamp gave them nowhere to hide. A raider corporal later wrote, "If you're close enough to smell them, you're close enough to fire. And if you're firing a shotgun, that's all you need." The swamp didn't favor the strongest or the fastest. It favored the man who could shoot first and end it fast. By late 1942, the Japanese High Command began to realize something was wrong. Their night assaults on Guadalcanal, once their most feared tactic, were failing again and again. The doctrine had been built on speed, on aggression, on the belief that a sudden bayonet charge would break the will of any defender. It had worked in China, the Philippines and Malaya, but against Marines armed with shotguns and dug in tight, it was meeting a wall of fire. Reports filtered back from the front. Heavy losses before reaching enemy line. Assault wave halted under concentrated close fire. Unidentified weapon. Loud. Devastating. It wasn't unidentified anymore. The Americans had turned the shotgun into a defensive anchor. Each time a Japanese unit charged, they lost more men before they even reached the wire. And if they did reach it, they were met face to face by Marines pumping shotguns in the dark. Some Japanese units tried changing tactics entirely. Smaller infiltration teams, slower movements, spreading wide. But the jungle funneled them into narrow trails. No matter what they did, they still had to pass through those kill zones. The old glory of the bayonet charge, once their symbol of ferocity, was eroding with every failed assault. Courage alone couldn't beat buckshot. One officer later wrote bitterly in a captured diary, "We charge like waves against rocks. The rocks do not move." Guadalcanal didn't just mark a turning point in a campaign, it marked the death of an old way of fighting. The shotgun didn't just defend the line, it buried a doctrine. When the battle for Guadalcanal finally ended, the shotgun had already carved its name into Pacific warfare. But its story didn't stop there. As American forces pushed deeper into the islands, New Georgia, Bougainville, Tarawa, Peleliu, the lessons learned on Guadalcanal traveled with them. Unit commanders remembered what the 12-gauge had done in the jungle, and they made sure it was part of every close-in fight that followed. In the tight mangrove swamps and coral thickets of later campaigns, shotgun carriers often led the way. On patrol, their job was simple but deadly. Spot the enemy first, and make sure the enemy didn't get up. The Japanese, too, remembered. Their troops adapted, slower, quieter, using cover carefully. But they could never fully neutralize what the shotgun did best. In darkness and dense terrain, no rifle could match its sudden, crushing impact. By 1944, the shotgun was no longer viewed as a secondary weapon. It was an asset. Raiders, infantrymen, engineers, and patrol units carried it with quiet confidence. And beyond its tactical value, it carried a psychological weight. Even before the first shot was fired, the Japanese knew what waited if they came too close. Marines called it the trench broom. The Japanese called it something else in their diaries, the thunder in the jungle. What started as a throwback from an earlier war had become a symbol of close-quarter dominance in the Pacific. The shotgun wasn't just part of the fight, it defined how those fights ended. The battles on Guadalcanal were more than just another campaign. They were a collision between old traditions and new realities, between bayonet charges born from empire and the raw, close-range brutality of the 12-gauge shotgun. The Japanese infantry came armed with courage, discipline, and faith in their tactics. For years, their night assaults had broken armies and overrun positions. But in the black jungle of Guadalcanal, courage met something colder, louder, and deadlier: the boom of a shotgun in the hands of Marines who refused to break. The trench gun wasn't a miracle weapon. It wasn't modern. It was old steel and walnut wood carried by men soaked in mud and sweat. But in the right terrain, it turned the jungle into a fortress. It shattered the momentum of charges that had once seemed unstoppable. The bayonet was built for a war where soldiers met face-to-face in a final, desperate rush. The shotgun was built to make sure they never got that close. And so, in the humid nights of Guadalcanal, history turned. A simple, rugged weapon, one born in the trenches of a different war, silenced a doctrine that had terrified battlefields for decades. In the end, the jungle didn't belong to the loudest charge or the bravest rush. It belonged to the man waiting in the dark, finger on the trigger, listening for the rustle of an approaching enemy. If you want more true stories of courage, steel, and the machines that shaped history, subscribe and join us as we bring the past back to life.